All for Geek Alliance, and All for Geek Alliance presents Narration Fixation number 2, Poetry with Diane Severson.
Hi.
I am your host, Tommy Howell. And so the poetry, something I don't really feel like I know a lot about, but I did some poetry interpretation in high school, and I sent you one of those poems, and we'll talk about that later.
Okay.
So why don't you tell us how I found you, I guess, and what you're doing with respect to poetry.
Okay, well, don't feel like the Lone Ranger that you don't know much about poetry. I think the more I learn about poetry, the less I feel like I know. So, I mean, obviously it's a vast field, and I have limited myself to science fiction or speculative poetry. So I use the broad definition of science fiction poetry to include fantasy and horror and whatever else is just not mainstream poetry. So I guess you found me through Poetry Planet, which is my podcast segment that I do for StarShipSofa.com, the science fiction podcast magazine.
Very good. That is a mouthful. But I have news about Starship Sofa. I was listening to the latest Medcast episode that Tony put out, and he had a call for a narrator, so I emailed him and said, here's a link to one of my narrations. And so he sent me a story back to read, to produce. He wants it back in 2 weeks, and
oh, wow.
I did the initial recording this morning, so we'll see how that goes.
That's hardcore. They send me a story, and I'm like, oh, I'll try and get it done by June. Oh, wait a minute. I'm going to the States. Can I get it to you by the end of August? Oh, wait, no, school starts. I guess I'll do... You know, I mean, it's hard when you're doing these things in your free time and nobody's paying you.
Right.
You do it for the love of it, but if there's something else becomes a higher priority, it just, you know.
Well, that has been one of my goals for this, is to do a narration for a well-known podcast. So that's good.
Good. Yeah. Go for it.
And I think this might be for his new podcast that hasn't come out yet. That's
the fantasy one, the one that he. Oh, good.
Right. So there's a fantasy element in this story, but it's got urban elements also, but not. It doesn't seem like traditional or what we call urban fantasy now. So we'll see.
Okay.
It's like a Greek myth.
Cool.
Kind of reinterpreted. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that fits into the overall fantasy kind of, you know.
Yeah. It'll be interesting. We'll see how my voice turned out. It was kind of weird making the woman's voice deeper than the man's. So.
What?
No, it said the woman's voice was husky.
That's funny.
Kind of made her the sultry husky voice. So.
Awesome. I look forward to hearing that.
Yeah, I hope that I'll let everybody know when that comes out.
Yes, please do.
So, Poetry Planet, how did you get started doing that?
Oh, well, I'm not sure if it's a long story or not, but I had been doing story narration for Tony and StarShipSofa for a while, and he started sending me more and more poetry to recite. I think probably because he would get this poetry in from random poets, and he would send it off to me. Can you do this? And for me, poetry is really easy to record and produce. It's a lot easier than stories. Just a one-off poem, yeah. So I would do it, because it would take maybe 20 minutes or half an hour at most to do it, start to finish, and then I would pop it off to him. Anyway, so I started doing a lot of poetry for him. But then when I had my son, I stopped. I took a break from all narration activities just because I didn't have any time. And not that I have all that much more time now, but I started up again. I thought when my son was about 15 months old, I was thinking about what can I do for a New Year's resolution. And it popped into my head that I'd like to start up doing narrating again for Tony, and then I was thinking, but he hasn't done any poetry since I stopped doing it. He's just stopped running it on the show. Pardon?
Oh, okay.
No, I don't know if he'd been collecting it or not, but yeah, maybe he had been. I have no idea. But at any rate, he just hadn't been running it, and I thought that was a shame. And I had asked him, about it. I said, I want to start doing stuff up again, but what about the poetry? Are you not running poetry? No, he said, well, no, it's kind of, cobbling everything together. It's kind of hard with the, the little bits and stuff. And then that gave me the idea that there are a lot of other people who do longer segments on a particular subject. So I thought, well, I could try and do a poetry segment. Then we could still have poetry on StarShipSofa. It just wouldn't be a single random poem here and there. So that's how I got started doing Poetry Planet.
Oh, that's cool. And so that's the only place you run that. You don't have your own podcast or anything like that.
No, no, I haven't. Yeah, I suppose I could, try and do that, but I don't know, that side of things I haven't really gotten into. I just send him the file and he runs it and does all of that stuff.
Very good. I have a question from somebody in the audience. So let me see. I'm gonna put that on for you. He says he didn't know science fiction poetry was a thing, and how did he not know that? And Jens is in Germany, so I think he's in the same time zone as you.
Ah, yes, that would be.
So there's another link. There's another link in the show notes for today for another science fiction poetry segment on Strange Horizons, and they run their poetry show once a month. So I'm gonna.
That's right. Yeah, I just discovered that myself. Although, well, I guess it hasn't been running that long. But oh wait. Jens, hello.
He's in Hanover, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, really?
Yes.
Da habe ich auch gewohnt. Anyway, sorry, I'm speaking a little German for Jens. How did you not know this was a thing? I didn't know it was a thing until Tony sent me some science fiction poems to read for the show. I mean, as a singer, obviously, I have a certain amount of connection or to poetry, but it's all in connection to what I've been singing. The classical music that I sing is often just poems, songs to poems, and yeah. So I really have always enjoyed poetry, but science fiction was for me literature. I never thought that maybe there might be people who wrote poetry on science fiction themes. So when Tony would send me this stuff, I'd be, wow, this is really cool. I love this stuff. And really reading it aloud is what brought it alive to me. If I had just read it somewhere randomly, I'm not sure I would have thought it was so cool. But, but and then when I decided to do this segment, I thought, oh, well, I'd better get a bit more of a clue. So I, did some research online, and I found a whole bunch of stuff, and I even found a whole association. The Science Fiction Poetry Association is like what the Science Fiction Writers Association is, just specifically for poets.
And so those were the two episodes, the two most recent segments you did for StarShipSofa are on the poems from last year?
Yeah. I have, well, since I started doing Poetry Planet, I've done a Rhysling Award showcase show every year. So there's, I didn't do 2010. I did 2011, 12, and now this most recent one was 2013. And
that was very cool. That one long poem that took its own segment.
Yeah, well, it was 15 minutes long, all on its lonesome. And I just thought putting it at the end of the show would make the whole show 45 minutes long, and I just thought, oh, people are going to skip past it and not even listen to it. They're going to get tired, Because I know listening to poetry, is fun, but it takes a certain amount of concentration. If you don't stay with it, you miss it. And that particular poem I thought was so great, it really deserved an extra show.
And that's on at the beginning of that episode of StarShipSofa, so you get it right away, and you've got all your attention already. So you're not having to, because his episodes are really long. Yeah.
Some of them are, they can be, yeah. I hardly ever listen to one in one go.
Yeah.
Never works. So.
So I asked you some questions, prepared questions about how do you read poetry different from prose, or is there any special techniques or rhythm or anything like that that you can tell us about?
Well, yeah, I like to try and find out as much about the poem as I can. Since I'm not particularly knowledgeable, I usually, like I can read a poem and I don't necessarily know if it's in a particular rhymed meter or whatever, unless it's like Dr. Seuss. That's pretty obvious.
Right.
But uh, I usually ask the poet themselves to if they have any information they want to impart about the poem itself. And sometimes I include that information in the show in Poetry Planet. So what their inspiration was, and they then sometimes tell me, okay, this is a sonnet, and it actually rhymes. Sometimes it's obvious, and sometimes it's not so obvious that it has a specific meter. So I try to pay attention to the meter. I pay attention to the line breaks, although sometimes that can be really difficult if the sentence structure continues through the line break. So I just, I try it out and see what works. If I can pause at the end of the line to show that that's a line break, I'll do it. If it really makes it weird, I don't. It just depends.
So let's talk about that poem I sent you about the two computers talking. I got that.
Oh yeah, that was
from Robots.
I love
which is
that
a
poem.
collection.
Yeah.
And so I first read that back in like 83 or 84, and I was doing it for competition for poetry interpretation.
Yes.
And so there was an editorial directive at the beginning of the poem that I didn't send you. It just said sotto voce. And so you're supposed
Sotto
to,
voce.
supposed to
Oh,
speak
so
softly.
speak softly. Ah, yes.
Yeah.
I guess like they're whispering to one another.
Yeah. And so did it seem like a dialogue to you, or was it more like a monologue?
Let me see if I can find it.
Because I sent you all the indentions and things that were in there.
Yeah.
Sometimes I felt like it was just a monologue. So.
Yeah. Well, I didn't really read it. I didn't read it that way as a dialogue. Yeah, I was kind of wondering what the indentation and stuff meant. But to be honest, I only read it once, or I think I only read it once. So I didn't really get too deep into it. It seemed like it could be done as a monologue, and no one would be the wiser.
Right. I just thought it had some fun imagery, and when I was thinking about it, I saw that it was originally published in 1958.
Yeah.
And some of the technology references in it were already obsolete by 1958 because transistors were developed in 57. So it's like that just completely made vacuum tubes obsolete. So it's just a funny thing about reading some of these old science fiction things is they talk about these technologies that had just been, it's like, oh yeah, there was that. It didn't last very long, but yeah, that happened.
Yeah, well, dated poems, I think it's kind of like reading dated science fiction, where you just kind of gloss over the outdated technology and whatnot that they're talking about. You can kind of extrapolate in your own mind what that might mean for us today. I think for me I don't care really. I still think it's a great poem. I really enjoyed it. So
right, and the bulk of the poem, I mean, if you just ignore some of the obsolete technology things, but it's really relevant still because we're still talking about artificial intelligence and
absolutely, yeah.
That. And so this is really a legitimate thing that two artificial intelligences could be discussing.
Yeah.
It's just some of the way they go about it is a little silly, but it's a lot of fun.
Yeah.
So do you have any directives or advice for me since I want to do a new reading of this for my personal channel and post it after we finish today?
Okay. Well, I think. Do you want to read? Do you have any particular part of the poem where you're feeling, like you need help specifically, or because that would probably be the best if you want to just read a bit of it and then, hopefully I'll have something to say, or hopefully not. I don't know. Yeah.
I don't know. How much emotion do you think should be in this, since it's
two computers
talking?
Yeah.
And but they seem to have a good bit of emotion several times.
Mm-hmm. Well, they seem to speak rather colloquially. I can't say that word. This sort of thing happens to me when I'm narrating all the time.
Yeah.
That I find one word that I just cannot say. I have to say it millions of times. Anyway, you know what I'm saying? They speak very easily to one another. They don't sound like computers, really, I don't think.
Right. I mean, occasionally they do. It's as if their circuits, instead of having just two positions, on, off, were run by rheostats that allow, if you'll pardon the expression, an indeterminate number of stages in between. So.
Yeah, there are a couple of times where they're obviously talking about themselves as computers.
Right.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess maybe my recommendation would be to maybe try to keep the sarcasm, or like the tongue-in-cheek kind of thing to a minimum.
Okay.
Just where, in just a few spots, maybe, where you think they're kind of being obtuse, like this thing about love.
And all the parenthetical things are probably the places you would want to, be a little snarky. The model with the soft flowing lines and high-pitched tone.
Yeah. Yeah, I would. I mean.
And I guess at the end line.
Men may take over the world. Yeah, that I think. Yes, I don't know. I mean, you can play with it a little bit, but my sense would be to try and keep the snarkism to a minimum, because if it's a long poem,
yes,
a relatively long poem, and if the whole thing is kind of snarky and sarcastic, it might be a bit too much. By the same token, if you do it too serious, I think you just need to find a good balance between, when you can be snarky and when you should, just be real, as real as you think a computer could be.
Okay. I got another question from Jens here. So he asks, is it done? You see that? Let's see. There we go. Yes? No? Oh,
no, I don't.
Hang on.
I see it. Oh, there we go.
Better. Yeah. One more question to speculative poetry. What does make poetry speculative? Is it only the subject matter, or are there more other attributes to make it like specific styles?
Okay. Well, there's Suzette Hayden Elgin, who founded the Science Fiction Poetry Association. She also wrote a handbook on science fiction poetry, and she said that in order for it to be science fiction poem, there need to be two elements to it, which are pretty obvious. It has to have some sort of science element and some sort of narrative element. Otherwise, if it just has science, it's just a science poem. And there are a lot of science poems. If it doesn't have anything about science or future worlds or something like that, it's just a narrative poem. So it needs to have those two elements. As far as speculative poetry, I think anything that would trip in your mind, this is science fiction or fantasy or horror or whatever, if your mind says it has this sort of label, I would put it in the speculative poetry box. But my box for speculative poetry is very large.
So it could include any style of poem at all.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of poetry that's being written these days, riffs on fairy tales and mythology and stuff like that. I would even put that. I mean, obviously it would depend on the poem itself, but I think a lot of that I would put in speculative poetry as well. In fact, for Amazing Stories, I've reviewed several collections which were basically fairy tales told in a new light.
Well, tell us more about what you do for Amazing Stories, because I didn't know about that until I went
Oh.
digging through your website the other day.
Okay. Well, that's why I didn't do so many Poetry Planets last year, is because I got all taken up with doing Amazing Stories. I had originally thought I would blog for Amazing Stories once a month, and then I thought, oh, that's not enough, so I'll do twice a month or every other week. So it was in 2012, I saw a call put out by Steve Davidson, the editor of the website, that he wanted to put together an extensive blog team for this website, and he was open to anybody blogging on anything, really. And so I contacted him. I thought, I'm looking for a wider audience for the reviews that I do on poetry collections, because I just decided I would start doing that and post them on my blog, but nobody reads my personal blog, so.
Evidently you do have a fan, because you've got somebody watching here.
Oh yeah, Jens, hi.
No, you've got Mike in Wisconsin.
Oh yeah, Mike. Hi Mike. Yeah, he's a StarShipSofa guy. And anyway, there's I do this blog. I mostly review collections. The initial bunches of collections that I reviewed, I just chose myself, but then I started getting some poets that would send me their collections. It's not overwhelming at the moment, but it's starting to take on a life of its own. So my original idea was to do reviews and do some interviews, and if I'm in a pinch for content, I do a roundup. I just kind of surf the web for science fiction or speculative poetry and collect it, maybe review some of it. There's so much on the web to read. It's overwhelming, really.
Yeah, just every niche is very full of stuff. So anything.
Yeah. Well, and there obviously there's a lot of tripe out there that you can find, but there's really a lot of good, very, very good speculative poetry magazines online that are specifically dedicated to poetry, and then there's always magazines like Strange Horizons and Apex and God.
Somebody else did a collection of speculative fiction poetry in conjunction with the Geek's Love or Ladies Love, something.
Oh, the Geek Love anthology. That wasn't poetry. Yeah. That wasn't poetry. I don't think.
They had a poetry collection, one of those.
Oh yeah.
Lynn Thomas collections.
Oh.
I don't remember.
I'm not familiar with that. Sorry.
What show do I listen to? SF Squeakcast. That talked about that one time.
Oh, huh. I missed that one. Did
you have a reading prepared for us?
I do, as a matter of fact. I would love to. This is by Anne K. Schwader, who is one of my absolute most favorite poets of any sort, living or dead. And she lives in Colorado, and she writes mostly science fiction and horror, or I suppose even weird poetry, because she's a Lovecraftian. So she has an entire collection of weird poetry. It's thick, and because I'm only just starting to learn of the wonders of Lovecraft, I haven't read it that much. But anyway, she has this entire collection of weird poetry. But she also writes excellent science fiction poetry, and she is also a formalist. She enjoys writing poetry in formal rhythm and meter and rhyme. And so this poem was the 2010 winner of the Rhysling Award in the short poem category. It's called To Thea. or to Thea. I don't know how to pronounce it. Thea. I did actually look it up. They said it could be either. That's another thing. I always have to look up words that are unfamiliar to me and see if I know how to pronounce them. If I think I might not, I always look it up. Anyway, so this is to Thea. Thea, a hypothetical protoplanet, is central to the great impact theory of the moon's origin. That you were our meant Earth and not this other, flawed marble we crawl over, cling to, dream, in fits of leaving, surely this suspicion once wove Atlantis through us, carved out Eden between our ribs. That we were shattered creatures, our sacred texts destroy us, but not why. The iron that marks our blood is restless, seeking some heart beyond our hearts. No second impact remains to reunite our cores. Lagrange holds only pebbled mercies, shooting stars, not worth the wishing on. Come summer midnights when song dogs serenade your final shard, we cannot help but raise our faces also to that remotest of reflected blessings, and howl you, Thea, as the home we lost. So this is one of those poems where it's kind of useful to know what the heck she's talking about. So, yeah. So if you don't know who Thea is, she was a Titan. She gave birth to Selena, the goddess of the moon. Or Thea is the name of a planet, a theoretical planet, like she says at the beginning, a hypothetical planet, which from which our moon sprang. Yeah. Right. So that's what. Shall I read it again with that in mind? It's not. I mean, it's not. Yeah. It's not kind of a long. It's not a long poem. I'll just read the first stanza. By the way, this is what Anne said was a blank, unrhymed iambic pentameter, which is kind of what Shakespeare wrote in a lot. It's the one that goes da-dum, da-dum, da-dum.
Right.
Yeah, with a certain number of syllables per line. All right, here we go. The first actual stanza, I'll start with that. That you were our meant Earth and not this other, flawed marble we crawl over, cling to, dream. In fits of leaving, surely the suspicion once wove Atlantis through us, carved out Eden between our ribs. So.
Yeah, that's, wow. It really calls you back to ancient times.
Yeah, yeah. I didn't know this poem. I asked her if she had something that I could read, because I kind of wanted to do something I'd never done before, and
right.
And strangely, I didn't know this one at all. I don't know how I missed it.
So that was the year you did not do the Rhysling.
Exactly. I don't know why I didn't. Anyway, yeah. So.
Well, do you have anything else you want to tell us about poetry and reading poetry to encourage people that might want to do reading aloud somewhere?
Yeah. Well, you mean podcasting poetry, or just anywhere?
This is YouTube, so yeah. On YouTube or
okay.
Podcasting, anything.
Yeah.
Or in a live setting.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there are tons of poetry readings, and it's mostly poets reading their own poetry, which which sometimes can be really great, and then I mean, most of the time I think it's great that, and especially poets know how to read their own poetry. But I often, I always ask a poet for my podcast if they want to read their own poem, and sometimes I'll get a reading which sounds like they're standing on a stage without a microphone, in front of people that don't have the text or anything in front of them. Well, I mean, for podcasts, people don't have the text in front of them either. But anyway, it sounds very stilted to me. I prefer, and I think it helps your average poetry listener to read it as naturally as possible. I mean, something like Anne's poem to Thea is difficult because it has a rhyme and a meter, or this one doesn't have rhyme, but there's a particular meter that she wanted to adhere to, and sometimes those sorts of formal poems can be difficult. But as long as it's free verse, I think it can really enhance it if you speak normally. Like try and keep to the normal sentence structure as much as possible.
Okay. I think you're answering Yen's question here about how do you go about figuring out how to read a poem, the emotion, inflection, pauses.
What happened here? I wanted to read the question myself. No? Hello. Well, anyway, I kind of answered it already. I read the poem, and then I always read it aloud, because that really makes a difference. I hardly ever just read poetry, silently, because especially if I'm going to podcast it, it doesn't make any sense. It's one more bit of practice to read it out loud from the get-go. And then, sometimes there are difficult bits, and if something has a regular meter and rhyme, then you have to kind of figure how much are you going to emphasize that or de-emphasize the meter and the rhyme. I think it's different according to each poem. And I try to spend some time with each one. Not a lot of time. It's not that if you spend too much time, then it kind of loses freshness. But I definitely read things 2 or 3 times before I attempt to record it.
And here's Mike asking, how many takes are usually involved? You get it right the first time.
Well, actually, for when I record, I don't do takes per se. I just kind of read it, and if I make a flub, I make a noise like that was probably
so
that probably hurt.
It's in the file.
Yeah, and so that it's obvious on the screen, when I edit it where the flubs were, and obviously I hear that, and then I fix it later. So I always just keep reading, and if I make a mistake, then I read the line over again, or I go back a little bit and redo it, depending on how much sense it makes, how far to go back.
That's what I would do in a prose narration also.
Yeah, I do that too. That was actually a suggestion of Tony's to just make some noise and then just keep recording. Especially because I use Audacity, and it's really tedious to have more than one track going.
Yes.
Yeah.
So,
I don't know how it is with other software programs. I lost your live video.
Oh, did my video go? It's showing me. Okay.
I see your picture, but I don't know what happened. Oh no, there we go. Okay, I just was clicking on the wrong guy.
I can force it to be on a particular screen from here, but
right.
That's how I put the questions up. So.
Okay.
What else? Is there anything else you wanted to mention?
Well, I do also include recordings of poems from the collections that I review on Amazing Stories. I usually do those as individual files, depending on how long the poem is. If, for instance, I did a review of a collection called Cthulhu Haiku.
Oh my.
That was really fun, but of course, then all of the poems being fairly short or even haiku length, it didn't make sense to make 50 recordings of 3-line poems. But so I did a kind of excerpts all in one file. But usually I'll do one poem per file for Amazing Stories.
And so there's a link to your contributor page on Amazing Stories in the show notes.
Super. Thanks.
So I'm going to wrap it up. And in the next, and we'll be back. Blah. So Narration Fixation will be back in 2 weeks, and I'm going to have another StarShipSofa alum, and that's going to be Josh Roseman. He is an author and a narrator. And one of the links you sent me where you had a Poetry Planet, he was the narrator. So.
Oh.
That's funny.
Very
It's just
good.
funny.
Okay.
And I will talk to you later, and you'll be invited to the next one. So if you wanna watch and contribute and ask questions, you can do that.
Great. Thank you. Thanks very
All
much
right.
for having me.
Thanks for coming on, Diane.
Bye.
Bye.